The summer heat in Washington, D.C. was unbearable, with tourists from around the world flooding the nation's capital to witness its historic monuments. Among them was Jake Morrison, a 23-year-old college dropout from California, who carried himself with an air of arrogance that seemed to repel everyone around him. He had come to the city not out of respect for history, but because his wealthy father had cut off his credit cards and demanded he find a job. The trip was supposed to be his last hurrah before facing the real world. Jake walked through the streets with his phone constantly in hand, live streaming to his modest following of 300 people, who seemed to enjoy his cynical commentary about everything he encountered. He wore expensive designer clothes that his father had bought him, and his attitude suggested he believed the world owed him something simply for existing. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, and his blue eyes held a coldness that came from never having faced real hardship. As he approached Arlington National Cemetery, Jake felt a familiar surge of rebellious energy. He had always been the type to question authority and mock traditions he didn't understand. In high school, he had been suspended multiple times for disrespecting teachers and making jokes during solemn assemblies. His parents had tried everything from therapy to military school threats, but nothing seemed to penetrate his thick shell of entitlement. The cemetery's entrance stood before him like a gateway to a world he had never truly comprehended. The white headstones stretched endlessly across the rolling green hills, each one representing a life sacrificed for freedoms Jake had always taken for granted. But instead of feeling humbled by the sight, he felt annoyed by what he perceived as an elaborate display of nationalism. "Check this out, guys," he said into his phone camera as he began walking through the cemetery grounds. "We're about to see some of America's finest theater. All this drama over dead people who probably died for nothing anyway." His followers in the chat began responding with a mix of shocked emojis and encouragement for his irreverent commentary. Jake had grown up in a wealthy suburb where his biggest concerns were which party to attend on weekends and whether his father would buy him the latest sports car. He had never known anyone in the military personally, and his understanding of sacrifice was limited to giving up his favorite restaurant reservation when something better came along. The concept of dying for one's country seemed antiquated and foolish to him. As he walked deeper into the cemetery, he passed families quietly paying respects to their loved ones. He saw elderly veterans in wheelchairs being pushed by their children, their faces etched with memories of battles fought decades ago. He noticed young widows placing flowers on graves, their children asking innocent questions about Daddy who would never come home. But instead of these scenes touching his heart, they only fueled his desire to create more controversial content. His phone buzzed with notifications as his viewer count began to climb. Word was spreading on social media about his disrespectful livestream, and people were tuning in either to support him or to witness what they hoped would be his comeuppance. Jake thrived on attention, whether positive or negative, and the growing audience only emboldened him further. The path led him up a steep hill toward the most sacred part of Arlington National Cemetery. Other visitors moved with quiet reverence, speaking in hushed tones or walking in contemplative silence. Children instinctively seemed to understand the solemnity of the place, staying close to their parents and asking questions in whispers. But Jake continued his running commentary, making jokes about the excessive drama and questioning why society chose to worship fallen soldiers. As he crested the hill, the tomb of the unknown soldier came into view. The white marble structure stood in stark contrast against the clear blue sky, its simple yet powerful design commanding respect from all who approached. The eternal flame flickered nearby, and the changing of the guard was scheduled to begin in just a few minutes. Jake had arrived at the perfect time to create the most controversial content of his young life. The crowd gathering around the tomb was diverse, yet united in their respectful demeanor. Families from different backgrounds stood together. Veterans saluted quietly, and tourists from foreign countries observed with curiosity and respect. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of history and sacrifice, but Jake felt none of it. To him, it was simply another opportunity to challenge what he saw as mindless tradition. He positioned himself near the front of the crowd, his phone held high to capture the best angle for his live stream. The viewer count continued to climb as word spread across social media platforms. Some viewers begged him to show respect, while others encouraged him to push boundaries even further. Jake fed off the chaos he was creating, feeling more alive than he had in months. The sentinel on duty stood motionless at his post, his uniform immaculate and his bearing perfect despite the sweltering heat. His rifle rested against his shoulder with precision that spoke of countless hours of practice and dedication. Every button, every crease, every detail of his appearance was flawless. But Jake saw only what he perceived as an elaborate costume worn by someone playing dress-up for tourists. As the minutes ticked by and the crowd grew larger, Jake felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before he did something he knew would shock people. He had built his entire identity around being the person willing to say and do what others wouldn't dare. In his mind, he was a truth-teller exposing the absurdity of blind patriotism and military worship. The silence around the tomb was profound, broken only by the occasional whisper or the soft footsteps of approaching visitors. Birds chirped in the distance and a gentle breeze stirred the flags that surrounded the memorial. It was a moment pregnant with possibility, a crossroads where Jake would either discover something greater than himself or confirm his cynical worldview. Little did he know that his life was about to change forever through an encounter that would shatter his assumptions and force him to confront the true meaning of honor, sacrifice, and respect. The stage was set for a lesson that would echo far beyond his social media following and into the depths of his character. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and Jake positioned himself strategically where his phone could capture every angle. He had researched the ceremony beforehand, not out of respect, but to understand the performance he was about to critique. In his mind, the elaborate ritual was nothing more than an expensive piece of military theater designed to manipulate emotions and promote blind nationalism. The relief sentinel approached with measured steps, each footfall precisely placed on the rubber mat that protected the plaza. His movements were so controlled and deliberate that they seemed almost robotic to Jake's untrained eye. The young man behind the camera couldn't understand the years of training, dedication, and sacrifice that went into achieving such perfection. He saw only what appeared to be an overly serious person taking himself too seriously. "Look at this guy," Jake whispered into his phone, zooming in on the approaching sentinel, walking like he's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "It's just a job, dude. Relax a little." His followers in the chat were divided between those horrified by his commentary and others who found his irreverence entertaining. The viewer count had now exceeded 1,000, drawing attention from social media platforms far beyond his usual audience. The ceremony began with the traditional inspection of the relief sentinel by the sergeant of the guard. Every detail was scrutinized with military precision: the alignment of buttons, the shine of shoes, the positioning of medals, the cleanliness of the rifle. To the gathered crowd, it was a display of the highest standards and attention to detail. To Jake, it seemed like an elaborate waste of time and taxpayer money. As the ceremony progressed, Jake's commentary grew bolder. He made jokes about the robot soldiers and questioned why society chose to elevate what he saw as mindless obedience to authority. His phone captured every moment, broadcasting his disrespectful observations to an increasingly shocked and angry online audience. Comments poured in demanding he show respect, but Jake thrived on the controversy he was creating. The outgoing sentinel began his final walk across the 21 steps that he had walked thousands of times before. Each step represented honor, duty, and commitment to protecting the memory of unknown soldiers who had given their lives for their country. But Jake saw only repetitive marching that seemed pointless and outdated in the modern world. 21 steps, turn around, 21 steps back, Jake narrated sarcastically. "This guy's been doing the same thing over and over for how long? Talk about a dead-end job. I bet he's counting down the minutes until he can go home and live like a normal person instead of playing soldier for tourists." An elderly veteran standing nearby turned to look at Jake with disgust, his weathered hands clenched into fists. The old man had lost 3 buddies in Vietnam and had come to the tomb every year on the anniversary of their deaths. He whispered harshly for Jake to show some respect, but the young man only rolled his eyes and continued his live stream commentary. The relief sentinel took his position and began his first walk as the new guard. His movements were flawless, his bearing perfect, his dedication absolute. The crowd watched in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing something sacred. Children stood quietly beside their parents, instinctively recognizing the solemnity of the moment. Foreign tourists observed with curiosity and respect, many having traveled thousands of miles to witness this uniquely American tradition. But Jake's patience was wearing thin. The ceremony was taking longer than he had expected, and he felt the need to escalate his performance for his growing audience. The adrenaline rush of creating controversy had become addictive, and he needed bigger and bigger shocks to maintain the same high. He had started with minor disrespect, but now he felt compelled to push boundaries even further. "How long is this going to take?" he said loudly enough for nearby visitors to hear. "Some of us have actual lives to live instead of standing around watching grown men play dress-up. This is supposed to be honoring dead soldiers, but it looks more like a really boring parade that nobody asked for." Several people in the crowd turned to stare at him with expressions ranging from shock to anger. A young mother covered her child's ears, not wanting him to hear such disrespectful words in such a sacred place. A group of high school students on a field trip looked uncomfortable, unsure whether they should laugh or be offended. The elderly veteran who had spoken earlier was now visibly shaking with rage. Jake's phone buzzed constantly with notifications as his viewer count continued to climb. Screenshots and clips of his live stream were being shared across multiple platforms, drawing both supporters and critics. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, and hashtags related to his disrespectful behavior were starting to trend. He was achieving the viral fame he had always craved, but for all the wrong reasons. The Sentinel continued his duty, seemingly oblivious to the distraction Jake was creating. His training had prepared him for all kinds of weather, fatigue, and challenges. But dealing with disrespectful visitors required a different kind of discipline. The guard's focus remained absolute, his commitment unwavering, even as Jake's commentary grew louder and more provocative. "I mean, seriously?" Jake continued, his voice carrying across the silent plaza. "These guys act like they're guarding Fort Knox or something. It's an empty tomb. There's nobody even in there. Why are we pretending this matters? It's like having a security guard for an empty building and calling him a hero for doing his basic job." The crowd's mood was shifting from respectful observation to tense discomfort. People began moving away from Jake, not wanting to be associated with his behavior. Parents pulled their children closer, and several visitors started recording Jake's behavior with their own phones, capturing evidence of his disrespect. The situation was escalating beyond what anyone had expected. A security officer stationed nearby had noticed the disturbance and was quietly approaching Jake's position. The officer's job was to maintain order and ensure that all visitors showed proper respect at the tomb. He had dealt with disruptive individuals before, but rarely had he encountered someone so brazenly disrespectful in front of such a large crowd. Jake remained oblivious to the approaching consequences of his actions. In his mind, he was simply exercising his right to free speech and questioning traditions that he believed were outdated. He had no understanding of the pain his words were causing to the veterans and military families in the crowd, no comprehension of the significance of the place where he stood. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force Jake to face the consequences of his actions and begin to understand the true meaning of the ceremony he was mocking. Jake's disrespectful commentary had reached a crescendo when something unexpected happened. As he was making another sarcastic remark about the Sentinel's robotic movements, his voice cracked slightly from the heat and dehydration. He had been talking non-stop for over an hour, and the Washington, D.C. humidity was taking its toll on his body, though his ego wouldn't allow him to admit any weakness. "You know what?" Jake announced loudly to his phone camera while wiping sweat from his forehead. "I bet I could do this job better than Robot Boy over there. It's literally just walking back and forth. How hard could it be? I've been standing here longer than some of these people have been alive, and I'm not even getting paid for it." The elderly veteran, who had been growing increasingly agitated, finally couldn't contain himself any longer. With his wife trying to hold him back, the old man stepped forward and confronted Jake directly. His voice shook with emotion as he spoke, tears forming in his eyes as he pointed toward the tomb. "Son, you have no idea what you're talking about," the veteran said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of pain and loss. "That young man standing guard has volunteered for one of the most challenging assignments in the military. He's protecting the memory of soldiers whose families never got to say goodbye, whose children never knew their fathers, whose mothers never stopped waiting for them to come home." Jake turned his camera toward the old man, seeing an opportunity for even more dramatic content. Oh, here we go with the emotional manipulation, he said dismissively. Look, Grandpa, I get it. War is sad. People die. But turning it into some kind of religious ceremony doesn't bring them back. It just makes people feel better about sending more kids off to die in the next war. The veteran's wife gasped at Jake's callousness, and several other people in the crowd began voicing their disapproval. But Jake was riding high on the adrenaline of controversy and the growing attention his live stream was receiving. He couldn't see past his own need for validation to understand the pain he was causing real people with real losses. The security officer had almost reached Jake's position when something else caught everyone's attention. A commotion near the entrance to the memorial area indicated that someone important was arriving. A small group of people in military dress uniforms was approaching, led by a colonel who walked with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and respect. Behind the colonel walked a woman in her 70s. Elegantly dressed despite the heat, carrying a small bouquet of white roses, she moved slowly but with dignity, and her eyes were fixed on the tomb ahead. Accompanying her was a younger man in his 40s, who bore a striking resemblance to her, clearly her son, and a teenage boy who kept glancing nervously between his grandmother and the sentinel on duty. Jake immediately recognized an opportunity for more content and began filming the approaching group. "Looks like we've got some VIPs showing up," he announced to his audience. "Probably some politician coming to get his photo op with the tin soldiers. This is exactly what I'm talking about, using dead people as props for political theater." What Jake didn't know was that the elderly woman was Mrs. Eleanor Richardson, the mother of Staff Sergeant Michael Richardson, who had been killed in Afghanistan 3 years earlier. Her son's body had never been recovered, and she came to the tomb of the unknown soldier every year on the anniversary of his death, to honor not only him, but all the unknown soldiers who, like her Michael, would never come home to their families. The colonel who accompanied her was her son David, Michael's older brother, who had made it his mission to ensure his mother could make this pilgrimage every year. The teenager was Michael's nephew, who had been only 10 years old when his uncle died but was now old enough to understand the significance of their annual visit. As the Richardson family approached the tomb, Jake continued his commentary, unaware that he was about to mock the grief of a Gold Star mother in front of thousands of online viewers. His phone captured every moment as Mrs. Richardson slowly made her way to the rope line that separated visitors from the sentinel's path. The sentinel on duty had noticed the approaching family and, following protocol, maintained his perfect posture and continued his measured steps. But something in his bearing seemed to acknowledge the special significance of these particular visitors. The crowd around the tomb had grown quiet again, sensing that something important was happening. Mrs. Richardson stopped at the rope line and stood in silence for several minutes, her eyes fixed on the tomb. Her son David stood protectively beside her, his military training evident in his posture even though he was no longer in uniform. The teenager fidgeted nervously, trying to understand the emotions he was witnessing from his grandmother. Jake saw the family's solemn behavior as yet another example of what he considered theatrical patriotism. "Look at this performance," he whispered into his phone camera. "These people are acting like they're at a funeral. It's a tourist attraction, folks. These aren't even their relatives in there. But somehow standing here is supposed to make them feel patriotic and proud. It's emotional manipulation at its finest." The elderly veteran who had confronted Jake earlier was now standing near the Richardson family, having recognized Mrs. Richardson from previous visits. He knew her story and understood the profound grief that brought her to this place every year. When he heard Jake's continued mockery, his anger reached a boiling point. "That woman lost her son in Afghanistan," the veteran said loudly enough for Jake and several others to hear. "She comes here every year because his body was never found. Show some respect, you ignorant fool." Jake's eyes lit up with interest rather than shame. This personal drama was exactly the kind of content that would drive engagement through the roof. He adjusted his phone to capture a better angle of Mrs. Richardson while continuing his commentary. "So now we've got a grieving mother as part of the show," Jake said without lowering his voice. "I'm sure her pain is real, but coming here isn't going to bring her son back. This whole place is designed to make people feel like their sacrifice meant something, but let's be honest, he died for nothing. Her son died in a war that accomplished absolutely nothing except making defense contractors rich." The words hit Mrs. Richardson like physical blows. She turned toward Jake with an expression of such profound hurt and disbelief that even some of his online supporters began calling for him to stop. Her son David stepped forward with clenched fists, his military training warring with his instinct to protect his mother from such cruelty. But it was Mrs. Richardson herself who spoke, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the now completely silent plaza. "Young man," she said, "you're standing on sacred ground. These unknown soldiers died so you could have the freedom to say such terrible things. I just wish you understood what that freedom cost." Jake felt a momentary flicker of uncertainty, but his addiction to controversy and his fear of appearing weak in front of his audience drove him to double down on his disrespect. The stage was set for an escalation that would finally bring consequences for his actions. Jake's response to Mrs. Richardson's gentle plea for respect was the moment that would define the rest of his life, though he couldn't know it at the time. Instead of feeling shame or compassion, he saw her emotional vulnerability as weakness and an opportunity for even more provocative content. His online audience had grown to over 5,000 viewers, and the attention was intoxicating. "Listen, lady," Jake said, pointing his camera directly at Mrs. Richardson's tear-filled eyes. "I'm sorry your son died, but that doesn't make him a hero. He signed up to be a soldier, which means he knew the risks. Nobody forced him to go fight in some desert halfway around the world. That was his choice, and choices have consequences." The crowd around the tomb had gone completely silent except for a few gasps of shock and disgust. Mrs. Richardson's face went pale, and her son David stepped forward with his hands clenched into fists. The teenager beside them looked confused and angry, not fully understanding what was happening but recognizing that someone was hurting his grandmother. "Sacred ground," Jake continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "This is a tourist trap built to make people feel good about war. Your son didn't die for my freedom. My freedom was never threatened by some farmers in Afghanistan. He died because politicians needed a war to keep their defense contractor buddies happy, and your son was just cannon fodder." The elderly veteran who had tried to reason with Jake earlier was now shaking with rage. His wife was pulling on his arm, trying to prevent him from doing something he might regret. Other veterans in the crowd were moving closer, their faces dark with anger. The security officer was now pushing through the crowd, realizing that the situation was about to spiral completely out of control. But it was the sentinel on duty who would provide the response that changed everything. Throughout Jake's entire disrespectful performance, the guard had maintained his perfect composure, continuing his measured walk across the 21 steps as if nothing was happening. His training had prepared him for many challenges, but witnessing such blatant disrespect toward Gold Star families and the memorial he was sworn to, tested even his legendary discipline. As Jake continued his rant about the mythology of military heroism, the sentinel completed his walk to the far end of the mat and stopped. For a moment he stood perfectly still, his back to the crowd. Then, in a movement that was both unexpected and perfectly controlled, he turned to face Jake directly. The entire plaza fell silent. Even Jake stopped talking, suddenly aware that something significant was happening. The sentinel's movements were precise and deliberate as he approached the rope line that separated him from the visitors. His rifle remained at his shoulder. His uniform was still immaculate, but there was something in his bearing that commanded absolute attention from everyone present. When the sentinel spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent memorial. It was steady, controlled, and filled with quiet authority that came from deep conviction rather than anger. "Sir," he said, looking directly at Jake, "you're requested to show proper respect for this memorial and the visitors who have come to honor our fallen." Jake's first instinct was to mock this intervention as well, but something in the sentinel's presence gave him pause. The guard wasn't angry or emotional like the other people Jake had been provoking. There was something deeply unsettling about his calm authority, a quiet strength that Jake had never encountered before. "I'm exercising my First Amendment rights," Jake replied, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "You can't tell me what to say or how to behave. This is America, remember? The land of the free?" The sentinel remained perfectly still for a moment before responding. "Sir, you are absolutely correct about your rights. The soldiers represented by this tomb died to preserve those rights, including your right to stand here and express your opinions. However, this is hallowed ground, and all visitors are expected to conduct themselves with appropriate dignity and respect." Jake felt confused by this response. He had expected anger, confrontation, or authoritarianism, something he could use to portray himself as a victim of military oppression. Instead, he was faced with someone who acknowledged his rights while simultaneously challenging him to be better than he was choosing to be. "What if I refuse?" Jake asked, his bravado returning as he realized his audience was still watching. "What if I think your whole ceremony is a joke and I want to keep saying so? Are you going to arrest me for having an opinion?" The Sentinel's response would become legendary, shared millions of times across social media, and quoted in discussions about respect, duty, and the meaning of true strength. His words were carefully chosen, delivered with perfect composure, but they carried a power that cut through Jake's cynicism like a knife. "Sir, I cannot force you to respect this place or the people who have come here to grieve and remember. Respect cannot be compelled, it must be chosen. But I can tell you that you are standing on ground consecrated by the blood of soldiers who died, not knowing if anyone would remember their sacrifice. They had mothers who loved them, just like the lady you just hurt with your words. They had dreams and fears and hopes for the future, just like you do." The Sentinel paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "The tomb behind me represents more than just unknown soldiers. It represents the idea that no sacrifice should be forgotten, no service should go unrecognized, and no family should grieve alone. I stand here not because I have to, but because I choose to, because someone needs to remember and someone needs to care." Jake felt something shifting inside him, a crack in the armor of cynicism he had built around himself. The Sentinel's words weren't delivered with anger or condescension, but with a quiet certainty that was more powerful than any argument Jake had ever heard. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning his own behavior, rather than defending it. Mrs. Richardson was watching this exchange with tears streaming down her face, but they were no longer tears of pain. Something in the Sentinel's words had touched a place in her heart that had been broken for 3 years. Her son David stood beside her with his own eyes glistening, recognizing in the young guard something he had seen in his brother, a commitment to something greater than oneself. The crowd around the tomb remained silent, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Jake's phone continued to live stream, broadcasting this moment to thousands of viewers who were seeing a masterclass in dignity, respect, and moral courage. The comments section had shifted from encouraging Jake's disrespect to praising the Sentinel's response, but the guard wasn't finished. What he said next would complete Jake's transformation and provide a lesson that would echo far beyond the boundaries of Arlington National Cemetery. The Sentinel stood perfectly still for another moment, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of personal experience and hard-earned wisdom that came from years of dedication to something greater than himself. "Sir, I volunteered for this duty after my best friend died in Iraq. His name was Marcus Chen, and he was 22 years old when an improvised explosive device took his life while he was trying to help evacuate civilians from a bombed school. Marcus used to joke that he was too young to die and too stubborn to quit. He had plans to become a teacher when he got home, wanted to work with kids who reminded him of the ones he met overseas." Jake's phone trembled slightly in his hand as he continued recording. But for the first time since arriving at the cemetery, he wasn't thinking about his audience or his viral fame. Something in the Sentinel's voice was reaching past all his defenses, touching a part of him that had been buried under years of cynicism and entitlement. "Marcus never made it to the tomb of the unknown soldier," the Sentinel continued. "His body came home and his family was able to say goodbye. But standing here protecting this memorial, I think about all the Marcus Chens whose families never got that chance. I think about the mothers like Mrs. Richardson who still wake up every morning, hoping their phone will ring with news that their son has been found." Mrs. Richardson let out a quiet sob, and her son David wrapped his arm around her shoulders. The teenager beside them was now crying openly, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of loss that surrounded this place. The elderly veteran who had confronted Jake earlier had tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, remembering his own friends who never came home from Vietnam. The Sentinel's gaze shifted briefly to Mrs. Richardson before returning to Jake. "That lady you just called foolish for grieving? She's not here because someone told her to be patriotic. She's here because love doesn't end when life does." Her son Michael was a staff sergeant who volunteered for extra patrols because he wanted to keep his men safe. The last letter he wrote home talked about a little Afghan girl who reminded him of his niece back in America. He died trying to protect people he didn't even know. Jake felt his throat tightening, an unfamiliar emotion rising in his chest. He had built his entire identity around mocking what he saw as false emotion and manufactured patriotism. But the Sentinel's words carried a truth that couldn't be dismissed or ridiculed. These weren't abstract political talking points. They were real people with real stories of love and loss. "You asked what gives this place meaning," the Sentinel said, his voice growing stronger. "The meaning doesn't come from the government or the military or even from tradition. It comes from the simple human truth that some things are worth dying for. Not for glory or politics or money, but for the idea that strangers deserve protection, that children deserve to grow up safe, that freedom isn't free." The crowd around the tomb had grown larger as word spread about what was happening. People were sharing videos on social media, but now they were sharing the Sentinel's response rather than Jake's mockery. The hashtags that had started as criticism of Jake's behavior were evolving into celebrations of the guard's dignity and wisdom. "I've stood here in rain, snow, heat, and cold," the Sentinel continued. "I've maintained this post while sick, exhausted, and heartbroken. Not because I'm a robot or because I'm brainwashed, but because I believe that remembering matters, honoring sacrifice matters, making sure that families like Mrs. Richardson's know their loved ones won't be forgotten. That matters." Jake's online audience had grown to over 10,000 viewers, but the comments section had completely transformed. Instead of encouraging his disrespect, people were sharing their own stories of military service and loss. Veterans were posting about friends who never came home. Military families were expressing gratitude for the Sentinel's words. Teachers were saving the video to show their students. "You said my job was pointless," the Sentinel said, taking a small step closer to Jake. "But I've seen children learn about sacrifice by watching this ceremony. I've seen veterans find healing by knowing their service is remembered. I've seen families find comfort in knowing their loved ones are honored even when their names are unknown. If that's pointless, then love itself is pointless." Mrs. Richardson stepped forward, her voice stronger now despite her tears. "Young man," she said to Jake, "this soldier has given you more respect than you've shown anyone today. My son would have done the same thing, tried to help you understand rather than just getting angry. That's what real strength looks like." Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him, the elderly veteran with his Purple Heart pin, Mrs. Richardson with her son's folded flag in her purse, the teenager learning about sacrifice, the families who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects. For the first time in his adult life, he was seeing people not as content for his social media performance, but as human beings with stories deeper than his own shallow understanding. The Sentinel wasn't finished with his lesson. "Sir, you have every right to your opinions about war, politics, and military service. Many of the soldiers buried in this cemetery fought and died specifically to protect that right. But having the right to do something and choosing to do the right thing aren't always the same. Today, you've chosen to use your freedom to cause pain to people who are already carrying more grief than anyone should have to bear." Jake's phone was still recording, but his hands were shaking now. The confidence that had carried him through years of controversial behavior was crumbling under the weight of the Sentinel's calm, moral authority. He was being forced to confront the reality that his actions had consequences for real people with real feelings. "The question isn't whether you can continue to mock this place and these people," the Sentinel said in conclusion. "The question is whether you want to be the kind of person who chooses cruelty over compassion, cynicism over understanding, and selfishness over service. That choice is yours to make, but it's a choice that will define who you really are when all the cameras stop rolling and all the audiences go home." The plaza fell completely silent as the Sentinel finished speaking. Jake stood frozen, his phone still recording, his mind reeling from an encounter that had stripped away every defense mechanism he had ever developed. The moment had come for him to make a choice that would determine not just how this day ended, but how the rest of his life would unfold. Jake stood in the suffocating silence, his phone still recording, but his mind completely overwhelmed by what he had just experienced. The Sentinel's words had penetrated every layer of cynicism and arrogance he had built around himself over the years. For the first time since his teenage rebellion began, he was faced with someone who had responded to his cruelty not with anger or authority, but with dignity and truth. His hands trembled as he looked at his phone screen, seeing the flood of comments from his audience. But instead of the encouragement and controversy he usually craved, he saw thousands of people calling him out for his behavior. Veterans were sharing stories of fallen friends. Military families were expressing their pain at his words. Even his most loyal followers were telling him he had gone too far. Jake started to speak, then stopped. His throat felt tight, and words that had always come so easily to him seemed to have abandoned him completely. He looked at Mrs. Richardson, whose tear-stained face showed not anger but profound sadness, not just for her own loss, but for the young man who had caused so much pain without understanding what he was destroying. The elderly veteran who had confronted him earlier approached slowly, his anger replaced by something that looked almost like pity. "Son," he said quietly, "I've seen a lot of young men make mistakes. The question is what you do next that determines what kind of man you really are." Jake lowered his phone for the first time in hours, ending the live stream that had drawn over 15,000 viewers. The sudden absence of his audience left him feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never experienced. Without the validation of his online followers, he was forced to confront the reality of what he had done. "I don't understand," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you do this? How do you stand here day after day in all kinds of weather, protecting something that most people will never even appreciate? How do you find meaning in it?" The sentinel, who had returned to his post but remained facing the crowd, spoke again with that same calm authority. "Sir, meaning isn't something you find. It's something you create through your choices and actions. Every day I choose to honor the memory of those who can't speak for themselves. Every step I take is a promise that their sacrifice won't be forgotten. That's not something I do for recognition or gratitude. I do it because it's right." Mrs. Richardson stepped forward, approaching Jake with a gentleness that seemed impossible given how cruelly he had spoken to her. "Young man, my son Michael used to say that the hardest battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes the hardest battle is fighting against the worst parts of yourself. The selfishness, the pride, the fear of caring about something bigger than your own comfort." Jake looked into her eyes and saw not the weakness he had mocked earlier, but a strength that came from surviving the worst kind of loss while still choosing to love and hope. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar in his mouth. "I'm so sorry. I don't know why I said those things. I don't know why I thought it was okay to hurt you like that." "Because you've never lost anything that mattered," Mrs. Richardson replied gently. "Because you've never had to face the reality that some things are worth more than your own comfort or entertainment. My son learned that lesson and it cost him his life, but he chose to learn it anyway, because some lessons are worth the price." The teenage boy beside Mrs. Richardson spoke for the first time, his young voice cracking with emotion. "My uncle died before I really knew him, but my mom always told me he was a hero. I never understood what that meant until today. It's not about being perfect or fearless. It's about choosing to care about other people even when it's hard." Jake felt tears building in his eyes for the first time in years. The wall of cynicism he had built to protect himself from genuine emotion was crumbling, and he was experiencing feelings he had forgotten he was capable of having. Shame, remorse, and something that might have been the beginning of wisdom flooded through him. "What do I do now?" Jake asked, looking around at the faces that had transformed from angry strangers to people whose stories he was beginning to understand. "How do I fix this? How do I make up for what I've done?" The sentinel answered without hesitation. "Sir, the past can't be changed, but the future is still unwritten. You have a choice to make about who you want to be from this moment forward. You can use the platform you've built to spread understanding instead of division, to honor sacrifice instead of mocking it, to build people up instead of tearing them down." Jake nodded slowly, beginning to comprehend the magnitude of the opportunity in front of him. His social media following, which he had built through controversy and disrespect, could be transformed into something positive. The audience that had watched him mock a Gold Star mother could also watch him learn about honor, sacrifice, and the true meaning of respect. "Could I?" Jake hesitated, afraid to ask for something he didn't deserve. "Could I learn more about your son, ma'am? About Staff Sergeant Richardson? Not for my social media, but because I want to understand what I was mocking. I want to know who he was." Mrs. Richardson's face softened with something that might have been hope. Michael would have liked that. He always believed people could change if they were willing to listen and learn. He used to say that the biggest tragedy wasn't when good people died, But when people stopped believing that goodness was worth fighting for, the elderly veteran stepped forward again, extending his hand to Jake. "Son, if you're serious about learning, there are a lot of stories that need telling. Stories about sacrifice and service that go beyond politics and propaganda. Real stories about real people who chose to serve something bigger than themselves." Jake shook the old man's hand, feeling the strength and character in the weathered grip. "I want to learn," he said. "I want to understand. I want to be better than I was an hour ago." The sentinel prepared to return to his duties, but before he resumed his walk, he offered Jake one final piece of wisdom. "Sir, the path from selfishness to service isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But every step you take in the right direction honors the memory of those who gave everything so you could have the freedom to choose. Make your choice count." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Jake remained standing in the same spot where he had mocked a hero just hours earlier. But everything had changed. His phone sat silent in his pocket, his need for viral fame replaced by something deeper and more meaningful. He had come to Arlington National Cemetery as a young man who believed in nothing but his own entertainment. He was leaving as someone who had glimpsed the true meaning of sacrifice, service, and respect. 6 months after his encounter at the tomb of the unknown soldier, Jake Morrison stood in the same spot where his life had been transformed, but this time he was a completely different person. His expensive designer clothes had been replaced by a simple dark suit, and his perfectly styled hair was now cut in a respectful manner. More importantly, the arrogance that had once defined his personality had been replaced by genuine humility and purpose. Jake was no longer live streaming for controversy or viral fame. Instead, he had spent the past half-year traveling across the country, interviewing veterans and military families, learning their stories, and sharing them with a completely transformed social media following. His audience had initially followed him for his shocking behavior, but they had stayed to watch his remarkable journey of growth and redemption. The video series he had created, called Stories of Service, had become one of the most respected military tribute channels on social media. Each episode featured a different veteran or military family, telling their stories with the dignity and respect they deserved. Jake had learned to listen rather than mock, to honor rather than ridicule, and to serve others rather than just himself. Standing beside him was Mrs. Eleanor Richardson, who had become like a grandmother to him over the past months. She had taken him under her wing after his apology at Arlington, helping him understand not just her son's story, but the broader meaning of military service and sacrifice. Her influence had been transformative, teaching him that true strength came from caring for others rather than tearing them down. "Are you ready for this?" Mrs. Richardson asked gently, adjusting the small wreath of white roses they had brought to honor the unknown soldiers. Today marked exactly 6 months since Jake's infamous livestream, and he had asked to return to make a public apology and to share what he had learned during his journey of redemption. Jake nodded, his hand steady as he held his phone, which now served a completely different purpose than it had before. "I've been ready for months," he said. "I just hope I can do justice to all the stories I've learned, all the people who've forgiven me when I didn't deserve it." The ceremony was about to begin, and Jake had arranged to meet with the same sentinel who had changed his life. Sergeant First Class David Martinez had agreed to speak with Jake again, curious to see how the young man had responded to their encounter. The sergeant had dealt with many disrespectful visitors over the years, but Jake was the first who had asked to return and make amends. As the changing of the guard ceremony commenced, Jake stood in respectful silence, his phone recording but his focus entirely on the solemnity and dignity of the ritual he had once mocked. He now understood that every precise movement, every perfect detail, every moment of dedication was a prayer offered on behalf of soldiers whose names would never be known, but whose sacrifice would never be forgotten. When the ceremony concluded, Sergeant Martinez approached Jake with the same calm dignity he had displayed 6 months earlier. But this time, there was something different in his expression, a warmth that suggested he had been following Jake's journey and was pleased with what he had seen. "Mr. Morrison," the sergeant said, extending his hand in greeting, "I've been watching your work. Staff Sergeant Richardson would be proud of what you've accomplished in his mother's honor." Jake shook the sergeant's hand with deep respect. "Sergeant Martinez, I owe you an apology that's 6 months overdue. Your words that day saved me from becoming someone I never want to be. You showed me what real strength looks like, what real honor means. Thank you for not giving up on me when I had given up on myself." "The strength was always inside you," the sergeant replied. "You just needed to find a reason to use it for something greater than yourself. That's what service really means, using your gifts to serve others rather than just serving yourself." Jake turned to address his phone camera, but his approach was completely different now. Instead of seeking controversy or attention, he spoke with the quiet authority that came from genuine experience and hard-earned wisdom. "6 months ago, I stood in this exact spot and made the biggest mistake of my life," Jake said to his audience of over 500,000 followers who had joined him on his journey of transformation. "I mocked a hero, hurt a grieving mother, and disrespected a sacred place because I thought cynicism made me smart and cruelty made me strong. I was wrong about everything." Mrs. Richardson stepped into the frame, her presence adding weight to Jake's words. "This young man has spent the past 6 months learning what my son Michael died fighting for. The idea that we're all connected, that we all have a responsibility to care for each other, that some things are worth sacrificing for." Jake continued his address, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I've spent these months traveling across America, listening to stories of service and sacrifice. I've met Gold Star mothers who turned their grief into purpose, veterans who came home broken but rebuilt themselves to serve their communities, and young people who chose service over selfishness. Every one of them taught me something about what it means to be truly strong." The sergeant added his own perspective, speaking directly to Jake's audience. "True patriotism isn't about flag waving or political slogans. It's about the daily choice to serve something bigger than yourself, to protect those who can't protect themselves, to stand guard over the values that make freedom possible. Mr. Morrison has learned that lesson, and now he's teaching it to others." Jake's final words were directed not at his online audience, but at the tomb itself. "To the unknown soldiers resting here, I want you to know that your sacrifice wasn't wasted on me. It took me 23 years and the wisdom of people better than myself to understand what you died for. But I get it now. I promise to spend the rest of my life honoring your memory by serving others the way you served our country." As they prepared to leave Arlington National Cemetery, Jake reflected on how completely his life had changed. He had lost most of his original followers but gained something far more valuable, a sense of purpose that went beyond viral fame or social media metrics. His new audience consisted of people who shared his commitment to honoring service and building understanding rather than division. Mrs. Richardson had invited Jake to spend Thanksgiving with her family, where he would meet other relatives of Staff Sergeant Michael Richardson and continue learning about the man whose memory had helped transform his life. He had also been accepted into a volunteer program that helped veterans transition to civilian life, using his communication skills to serve others rather than just himself. The elderly veteran who had first confronted Jake had become a regular guest on his show, sharing stories from Vietnam and helping viewers understand the continuity of service across generations. Even the teenage boy who had witnessed Jake's transformation had started his own volunteer work, inspired by the change he had seen in someone he had initially viewed as hopeless. As they walked away from the tomb, Jake carried with him not just the memory of his shame, but the knowledge that redemption was possible for anyone willing to humble themselves and learn. The Sentinel's lesson about choosing to be better had taken root and grown into a life dedicated to service, respect, and the simple but powerful idea that every person has the capacity to change for the better. His phone buzzed with notifications from his latest video, but Jake barely glanced at them. The validation he had once craved from strangers online had been replaced by something far more satisfying: the knowledge that he was using his gifts to honor those who deserved honor, to serve those who had served, and to build bridges where he had once torn them down. The transformation was complete, but the journey of service had only just begun.